And we are very much live, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in our 149th live stream in the Data on Kubernetes community. As usual, my name is Bart Farrell, leader here at the Data on Kubernetes community, and very excited to be with you today as we approach this topic of overcoming the challenges of protecting migrating when we're in a multi-cluster, multi-cloud environment. I have two wonderful people that are going to be with us today to help us out with that. Before we get to that, these two wonderful people as well will be joining us either in person or in spirit in the next DoK day, which will be on October 24th in Detroit. We'll be doing this event in person, but of course it will also be live streamed. You have all the info about the event right there. Super easy to add to your KubeCon registration. If you're already registered for KubeCon, if you'd like to attend virtually, you just have to add it. If you want to attend in person, have a few more details to check out there. If you have any difficulties registering, please let us know on Slack and we will be happy to help you out. That being said, very happy to welcome two wonderful people from CloudCasa by Catalogic. I'm sorry, the tongue twister. CloudCasa by Catalogic. We were talking about Duolingo before we got started, and that could be included there as well for pronunciation practice. Martin, Field CTO, and Sebastian, Architect. Very nice to have you both with us today. How you guys doing?
Good, Bart. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Good. That being said, to get a little bit of background, can we start with you, Martin? Can you just give us a little bit of info about your Kubernetes journey, how you got started, and how you encountered first this notion of stateful workloads?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Martin Phan. I'm a field CTO here with Catalogic Software. So I've actually been with Catalogic. We're a data protection company. So I've been doing data protection, for over the past 15, more than that actually. So I've been doing
sometimes
a lot of
more than we like to admit, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just working in backup data protection, but with Kubernetes, it was a game changer for me, right? So I've been working with Kubernetes now for the past couple of years, and we realized that as a data protection company that and users moving into the cloud and stateful workloads and containerized workloads, that data protection would be changing very drastically from the way in which we think about data protection today. So we had to change our game as well. And that's how I got my start within Kubernetes and, just looking more towards learning more about it and sharing some of the information that we have found out in performing these types of different workloads and migrations and data protection within the cloud. So
awesome. Great. Like you said, the sort of paradigm shift, presented with new challenges. How are we going to face them? That's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And in your case, Sebastian, how did you get started with Kubernetes?
So my name is Sebastian. I'm a cloud architect at CloudCasa by Catalogic. And I started with Kubernetes, I believe, in 2020. So I had this Go programming background, and I believe almost everyone who knows Go knows the Kubernetes. So I started learning into that as a new technology, something new to learn. And I, instantly fell in love with this tool, right? Like it's auto-healing everything. Like it solved a lot of issues in IT. So that's how I started. Then I, found a job at Catalogic. I was, I believe, fourth member at CloudCasa team. So I've seen how it actually grew before even we went, public. And yeah, that's how I started. I still develop, in this area and still in love with Kubernetes.
Very, very good. Excellent to hear that. That being said, gentlemen, if you want to start sharing your screens, we can take a look at the slides. Folks that are in the audience with us on YouTube, as usual, if you've got questions, drop them in there. If not, we can always continue the conversation in Slack, but make sure you get your questions in there so we can address them accordingly. So like I said, if you want to start sharing your screen, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead, share my screen here.
Perfect.
And let me know when you can see that.
Yep,
Bart.
looks good. Yep.
Awesome. So I figure I'll get started here, and then I'll let Sebastian jump in with his. Sebastian being the cloud architect, he's got a lot of detailed knowledge in terms of how this is all implemented and some of the challenges and hurdles that we'd had to overcome in order to support these types of cloud migrations and backups of Kubernetes and restores within Kubernetes. But just to level set, hopefully everyone. I want to share some this first slide that I usually do when talking with customers in the field regarding some of Kubernetes strengths and weaknesses. And I think most of the people on this call know exactly where the strengths lie. And as a data protection company, we've discovered that there are weaknesses from a standpoint of backup and disaster recovery. We want to start simplifying these operations within our own data protection products that we supported and sold. But at the same time, we realized that they were, highly deficient simply because of the paradigm shift with stateful workloads within Kubernetes. And as we started developing our software as a service platform in CloudCasa, in trying to simplify these backup and recovery workloads, we started realizing that there were a lot more intricacies and details that need to be taken into account in order to move data between clouds. What differences and what uniquenesses between clouds we'd have to overcome in order to support these types of migrations. So what we did here, and I'm going to start with the big three. We developed this software as a service application called CloudCasa, and users are moving towards this software as a service, infrastructure as a service. In this case, we put up here 3 managed services providers, the big 3, Amazon, Azure, and Google. And these just happen to be the 3 that we also support within CloudCasa, or we've initially started natively supporting within CloudCasa from a managed Kubernetes perspective. But the point being is that as we looked at these different cloud providers and how we can go about interacting with them, we discovered that there were some very unique differences in terms of simplifying the ease of use.
Right. So there are a lot of cloud providers that support Kubernetes. Here we got like a top 3 players. It's impossible to pick the best one. All have their own differences, different strengths and weaknesses. But I will give you just a few features that really differs them. And starting with Google, the oldest player in town, 2015. We all know why Google was first, right? Google started with Kubernetes, so they were first to introduce an engine for that. But great thing about Google, when I was working on integrating that with CloudCasa, I really like the 2 different ways you've got to manage your cluster. The first one is the standard way, where you just set up all your networking settings, auto-scaling, node sizes. And the other one, which I believe they introduced a year back in 2021, this is autopilot way, where the Google deals with most of the underlying infrastructure. They deal with the auto scaling. You get this different pricing model where you pay per pod. So this is definitely nice. Google has also the great upgrade options. I really like that they have this maintenance window where you can specify where you want your upgrade to happen. This is very nice. But when it comes to Azure is definitely the cheapest one out there, I think. You can buy the cheapest node is for $30, and it gets 2 vCPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. So sometimes it's enough, and it can get that very cheap. Yeah, so all have different weaknesses. There's no one you can pick for your usage. You really need to deep dive into it and select what's best for you.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sebastian. I think at the end of the day, most users want to have that flexibility and freedom to adopt whatever services provider that best suits their needs, whether that be price or where they're hosting their other applications, corporate standards, right? And as Sebastian mentioned, each of these has their own uniqueness and capabilities, and how we can go about integrating with them without having to supply client access and secret keys around all over the place. Each of them have their own integration points, as you saw within that last chart there from Azure Resource Manager versus CloudFormation Stack, what have you. These are exactly the ways in which we are interacting with these different cloud accounts, and it's going to be the ways in which we discover and add other cloud accounts that we support natively. But we want the user to be able to take advantage of what Kubernetes service works best for them, right? And each of them are going to have their own uniqueness as well, from the storage providers that they have. For example, Azure Block versus Azure File, Amazon EBS, CSI EFS storage, Google Compute Persistent Disk. So each of these cloud service providers are going to have their own unique storage classes, and these are some of the considerations that you'll need to take into account when moving between the infrastructure. What happens if I'm moving between, let's say, EBS or CSI or Azure Disk versus Azure File? They're going to each have their own uniqueness. So not
Right.
all Yep, go ahead, Sebastian.
No, I was just wanted to mention that, CSI is a standard, right? And every CSI driver seems to be equal, but they actually differ from each other, right? So here we attach a screenshot from list of the drivers, just a part of it. There are a bunch of drivers. So you can see here some of the Azure ones, but the interesting case that we come across not that long ago was definitely Azure Files, right? So what we found interesting in Azure Files was that this CSI driver allow you only to take the snapshot, but you cannot use this driver to restart from this snapshot. So that is a problem, right? If you back up your data and then a disaster happens, you want to restore. And as Microsoft acknowledged in their documentation, you can do a restore only using either Azure Portal, or using the Azure CLI. So that is, of course, problematic, because as far as I remember, in Azure Portal, you can restore one file by one, and you need to create each directory manually. And with the CLI, most probably you would need to write some sort of a script that will restore the files for you. So that was a challenge. And how we in CloudCasa, we solved that. I'll give you a super high level overview. So when we come across a PV that uses Azure File CSI driver, and that PV needs to be restored, what we will do, we will find the right Azure file share. Then when we get the file share, we will find the right snapshot, and then we will file our data mover that uses official Azure SDK, and just restore automatically the files for you. So you can see, as a concept, it's super simple. I try to make it as simple as possible, not to get you bored. But if you want to get to know some details, you can definitely visit our blog post. So at cloudcasa.io/blog, there's this blog post where we give more details how that automated restore from Azure Files really works. So I really encourage you guys to read that and give us some feedback.
Yeah, that's great. And I actually read through this blog post as well. I shared it across the field and customer base here for those interested, or actually using their Kubernetes services or Azure AKS Kubernetes services within their implementation. And we get questions like this, right? How do you handle the differences between Azure Disk and Azure File? Because the scripts that and the backup policies that they use to maintain their restores will not work within that space. So I think, as they say, we can resolve things with software, and here we did that using our partnership with Microsoft and using other API sets that are detailed within this blog post to work around that issue with supporting the Azure Files environment. And this kind of comes into play with the scenarios of cross-cluster and cross-cloud migrations, right? You're moving, let's say, a Kubernetes cluster from Amazon to Azure. You're going to need to take that into account. And there are various different reasons why you'd want to move one workload from one cluster to another cluster. You just corporate standard, let's say, you're just trying to clone the environment. You're going to try to migrate to different cloud, cheaper storage class. And it's important to, if you can, to abstract that level of detail, especially if you don't want to be bothered by it. Kubernetes has certainly made things much simpler in terms of at least migrating and standing up stateless workloads. And what we're trying to do is ensure that you have the plans in place for standing up stateful workloads, and there are going to be some challenges in that as well.
Right. So one of the challenges that generally, clusters are isolated in terms of storage and networking, right? Clusters do not know each other. And if you want to, let's say, migrate your PV data, you don't want to expose that PV to a public network, obviously. So that is a problem. You've got different storage classes. So giving you an example, if you want to migrate, let's say, from EKS that uses EBS CSI driver, and you want to migrate your data to a different cluster, let's say it's EKS, but it uses this native EBS volume, you need to have a storage class mapping for that to make sure that the persistent data gets transferred. And same goes for even cross-cloud, right? If you want to migrate from let's say AWS to Azure, you've got your EBS volumes on AWS, and you get Azure Disk on AKS. You need to have a storage class mapping that will allow you to change the type of a storage. So another problem is obviously there's no native Kubernetes support for that. There are some common and well-known tools like Velero and Restic. I think everyone that started with data protection knows about Velero and Restic. But both those tools have some issues when it comes to multi-cluster or multi-cloud setup. So starting with Velero, you need to install Velero on each cluster that you have. And that becomes difficult when you have a multi-cloud or multi-cluster setup, because setting up Velero differs for each cloud provider that you have. So giving you Azure as an example, for Azure, you need to create a resource group in your preferred location. You need to create a storage account. Then for that storage account, you need to create a blob container. And then finally, you need to create and manage a service principal that uses a contributor role. And then here's a security concern. I can see that the contributor role has a subscription-wide access, and this is the second most powerful role in Azure. So if your credential gets leaked, someone can delete your resources in Azure, and obviously you don't want that. Or for example, for Google Cloud, what you need to do in order to set up your storage for Velero is you need to create a GCS bucket, and that preferably should be one per cluster. Once you have that, you need to create a service account, custom role, and that bind that all together for every project that you have. And the issue here is that structure of Google Cloud looks like you've got your organization, and within organization you've got multiple projects. So you need to repeat that step for every project you have. So we already see that even if you use one cloud but multi-cluster, this is becoming extremely difficult to maintain. But other issues with Velero is that you don't have any central logging or central, storage credential management. And also what's important when you have multi-cluster or multi-cloud setup, you should have a one place from where you can manage all your clusters or their backups and restores when necessary. And that is not supported with Velero. So giving you also a real-world example, at KubeCon in Valencia in May, we met one customer, and they've been using automated Velero. So they wrote their own scripts that would automate their Velero backups. But still, they were looking desperately for a solution that will allow them to manage that from one place, because even with automated scripts, it becomes hard to maintain such backup management.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sebastian. I actually am talking with another customer where I was, we were trying to get to the bottom of their infrastructure, and I asked them how many clusters they were running, and they shrugged their shoulders. They had no idea. And I asked them how many, cloud accounts that they had, and they were like, "Oh, we have 100 AWS cloud accounts, right?" From which there could be, tens to hundreds of clusters being managed by each cloud account. So I mean, it could scale rather rapidly. So having something like Velero can be good for a handful of clusters, but as your deployments start growing and your infrastructure starts scaling at Kubernetes scale, having that centralized management plane is going to be absolutely key and critical to your environment. But I think there are some other challenges with the Velero and Restic performance-wise that I think you can share too here as well, Sebastian.
Right. So at CloudCasa, we've got our own data mover that transfer content of the persistent volume. But before we started writing our own data mover, we compared both Restic and Copia. Both are very common backup tools. So when we started comparing Restic, the main reason why we decided to go with Copia was a full restore speed. And I touched here a comment by David, our principal engineer, who has great experience in data management and data protection industry. So we can see here that the Restic was using 100% CPU, and in 16 hours, we were only able to restore 15 gigabytes at a speed of 0.25 megabytes per second. And that is extremely slow, right? We're living in a world where your business runs on data, and you don't want to tell your customers that, hey, there was a disaster, we are recovering from it, but it will take us, like here in the comment, 2 months to be back in business. You don't want to tell your users or customers something like this. Also, the issues with Restic is it did not go very well with parallelism or dealing with small and large fires. So I attached here a screenshot from an Excel sheet that David wrote. So the first section over here is a backup, and the bottom one is a restore. So if you take a look at the backup, Restic 1 terabyte, 1 file, it took 4 hours to do a backup. But you see in Copia, this is the third entry here, also 1 terabyte, but 100 files, parallelism set to 16, and it took us 1 hour and 15 minutes to back up such amount of data. So this is more than 3 times faster than Restic do. But the biggest difference you can see is when it comes to restore. So the first entry in the bottom section, you can see a Restic only 15 gigabytes, and it took more than 16 hours to restore. And when you see the third entry, so Copia 1.5 terabyte, parallelism set to 16, that is only 4 hours. So we see a massive difference over here between Copia and Restic. But also why we decided to use Copia on our backend was that most of our components, microservices that we have, are written in Go. And Copia has a very well written Golang code, and that made our process really easy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you can see a lot of this taking the best of breed in terms of functionality and performance code that's out there, and then customizing it to the use cases that you would need, right? Whether that be performance in the backup or performance within the restore. Obviously, we sharing with you some of the alternatives and methodology that we went to and the reasons why. But being the backup company that we are, and as you start thinking about backup and restore, just as part of your day two, implementation of stateful workloads within Kubernetes, I think it's important to realize that you should think of your backups as more than just insurance policies, right? And with Kubernetes, right, we have the ability to take local snapshots to the CSI drivers. And as we learned, CSI drivers are not all created equally, but in order to ensure that backup, we need to move it, right? So what do you use as a data mover, whether that's Restic or Copia, right? Depending on the choices that you go with, is going to determine how quickly and easily you can spin up that data copy. But the important thing being is that we want to look at these copies as more than just insurance policies, right? The reason why most of you are here is to learn how we can move this data around between different clusters quickly and easily through services or through custom options. What options are actually available that you have out there? Sort of automating a restore process, if you will. And in Sebastian's example, where he had a customer writing their own custom scripts in order to around Velero in order to perform this backup and restore, they were running into their own challenges with regards to, do they have to modify or rewrite this script based off of scanning a new account? Let's say they want to spin up an entire new cluster from scratch. Would they need a standby cluster, or can they create an entirely new cluster from scratch when performing that restore? And then ultimately just having the knowledge of how each cluster is structured, from the storage classes and providers that it has to offer to the let's say the configuration of the cluster itself within the entire architecture. So taking into account what you're restoring, how many nodes, what type of scalability, what type of customizations. If you want to remap storage, rename your namespaces, perform this cross-cluster type restore. These are all things that you should be thinking about when you are moving data between clouds, or even on-prem to off-prem.
Right. So cluster recoveries are also an interesting topic because Velero, as well as other vendors, when you need to perform a migration, you need to spin up a new cluster on your own. So you need to deal with all the networking, load balancers, add-ons, node settings, installing the backup agent manually, setting up the access to storage. All of that you need to do on your own. And that is a multi-step process that very often take long hours to finish. How we solved that issue in CloudCasa is that we decided not only to protect your data, but also the infrastructure. And how we are making that is very also simple. So you've got this option to add your cloud account, for example, AWS or Azure. Once you add your account and you do a backup of your cluster, because we discover all the clusters automatically along with the resources that are required. Once you do a backup, before we take a backup of your data and persistent volumes, we'll take a backup of your cluster settings. So all the nodes, networking settings, all of that, we will take a backup. So when it comes to restore, when you want to restore your cluster, we can now fully recreate your cluster with the exact same settings like you had, or you can even modify the input. So let's say the workload in your cluster increased, and you need to have a bigger VM size. That's not a problem. You can select a bigger VM, and the rest of the settings will remain the same. And same goes, backwards. If you want to, for example, go from auto scaling to a static node count, that's also not a problem. You can do that. To sum it up, this is very important, not to only protect your data, but also protect your infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a great point, Sebastian. And by scanning in the infrastructure and knowing exactly what's out there, exactly how the node groups are configured and what permissions they're configured with, we can very easily spin up these clusters in the cluster BMR process through our software as a service in CloudCasa. And then other things that you would need to think about, especially when you're talking about centralizing management of Kubernetes backups, as we do within our software as a service application within CloudCasa. But you may be someone who is looking to back up to your own storage, as Sebastian mentioned. That cluster may not even have access to the public internet, right? So you may have configured the cluster using private link functionality within Azure or AWS. And these are just other considerations that we've taken into account, or that within CloudCasa that you would also need to take into account, especially if you're dealing with clusters that aren't able to talk to one another. So.
Right. So we already noticed that a lot of cloud providers, they introduce new services that allows you to keep your a connection more private, right? So great example is Azure Private Link or AWS Private Link. So for both cloud providers, that works the same. And how that works is that the network traffic that uses private links does not traverse the public internet, right? So it reduces the exposure to DDoS, brute force attacks, along with some other threats. So what that exactly is Azure Private Link is just a service that enables access to Azure services like Azure Storage, SQL databases, Azure K8s over a private endpoint in your virtual network. So in short, it just acts like a bridge between your virtual network and Azure services. And what the private endpoint is nothing but just a network interface that uses private IP address within your virtual network. So that is the description about where is the challenge, right? So the challenge is with accessing the data, how you can upload the data to a storage that has no public endpoint. And how we solve that, the CloudCasa team introduced something called proxy cluster to bring your own storage feature. And how that works is whenever you add your own storage, you can select that your storage is isolated, and you will be prompted to select a proxy cluster. And that proxy cluster is just a Kubernetes cluster that has CloudCasa agent installed on it. And every an object store operation will go through that cluster. Any update push or delete operation will go through that. And that's how we support it. But I believe we haven't tested it, but it should be also possible to set up Velero in a such way that it can use also the private endpoint and private links. So this is something to be tested from our side, but I'm pretty sure it should be possible.
Yeah, thanks for the additional detail. So that that proxy server is a great tool for kind of exposing excuse me, the traffic that should remain internal and private.
Just a quick question.
Yeah, Barrett.
So we got a couple, we got something, you know, Ravi mentioned that he thinks that restore should be automated in the CI/CD pipeline and automate testing of restore. Agree, disagree? Any thoughts on that?
So did you want to take a stab at this first, Sebastian, or?
So can you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. No, it's more just a comment, but just wanted to hear your thoughts on it. So the idea here is that, so Ravi says that, you know, that ideally that, you know, restore should be automated in CI/CD pipelines and automate testing of restore.
Right. So I actually agree with that. So you know, I came from a tech background, so I'm not a big UI fan. You know, whenever it's possible, I like to use so some bash scripts and all of that. So in order to use CI/CD pipelines, you don't want to use UI, right? You need to have some sort of an access, like a CLI tool or using, for example, API calls, right? So this is something that we also support. We haven't mentioned it here, but we do support REST calls with something called API key. So we can use curl, postman, anything that you like, and you can automate the restore using that feature.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, and just to add to some of that automation. So that same customer as I was referring to, right, from a provisioning and backup and recovery perspective, right? They are moving stateful volumes or these persistent volumes across their clusters, right? So when they provision a cluster, which they do so through automation, at the same time through these REST API calls, and they're able to provision a backup policy, a backup job, provision a restore policy that just restores and recovers the persistent volumes to a separate workload, and a graph or a chart whenever they need it, you know, in the central management plane for determining their at risk and whether or not they'd be meeting their SLAs should things ever go down and they're not able to, they lose all their stateful data. So.
Very good point. Cool. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, we've kind of learned this a lot of this through our history as a data protection company, right? And data protection has evolved quite considerably since, you know, I was doing data protection with tapes, and you know, eventually that merged to disks. But we still, you know, should look at data protection in, you know, this 3-2-1 rule, and this is kind of the principles that we've maintain when developing and looking at a simple solution that could help protect your Kubernetes and cloud native workloads environments. And that 3-2-1 simply means maintain 3 copies of your data, 2 copies on different sets of media, 1 copy at least offsite. In this case, your replicated copy to a different object storage or maybe even your own storage provider, and then a verified copy for recovery or a locked an object locked copy that you can use for recovery here. And with these principles, you know, we've developed CloudCasa behind establishing these principles such that they could use these for their workloads as they move or look to move, you know, their services and their applications into the cloud. I mean, our own product, which started the company, is now being containerized, right? So we can see these enterprise, large monolithic applications being containerized, getting moved into the cloud. But the mindset should still always be there from a backup and recovery perspective, from which you can glean other use cases like migration and test and disaster recovery. But you need to think about, you know, the recovery time and compliance, right? And how you can very easily ensure that you're backing up what you need to back up, right? Customers don't know, or there'll come a point where customers will not know how much infrastructure or resources and services they have out there. You know, and it happened with VMs, right? In physical server hardware, where it's like I could count the number of servers I have in my hand. Well, I won't be able to tell you the number of VMs, but I still want to make sure that they're all protected, right? And by scanning in a cloud account or talking to the managed service provider directly, you want to be able to, you can perform that audit discovery, ensure that you're never missing a cluster, because you're backing up and protecting at the managed service provider perspective. And from that perspective, you can also capture the configuration of the cluster, right? Which will help you then recover that into an entirely new cluster, into an entirely different region, while recreating it from scratch. Basically, recovery through code, as we call it, without the need to have to maintain a standby cluster that is just sitting around wasting resources, waiting for a restore to take place, right? You look at, as Sebastian mentioned, you look at all the processes that you would need to go through in order to just spin up a cluster. Is it going to be connected to the network? Does it have public, private IP access? Who's going to have access to this cluster? Who can scan in and register into their console, right? These types of configuration and permission issues can all be recovered and handled through recovery through code. And I didn't want this to be too pitchy with CloudCasa, but just some of the challenges that we ran across when developing our CloudCasa, our software as a service application known as CloudCasa. So this is backup as a service for Kubernetes, in which we're hosted in the cloud. So there is no infrastructure application that you would need to install. It's just a portal that you would go in and log into to set up policy and define backups and restore policies for the clusters that you have running in the cloud or on-prem. And this is an entirely free service that you can use for free if you're just looking to manage snapshots. Let's say you're looking or you're outgrowing the capabilities of Velero, your infrastructure is kind of starting to encompass a cloud-centric approach in addition to on-prem. So you're kind of in this hybrid cloud operating environment. More users are now starting to come onto it. Definitely sign up for your free account because that's going to allow you to define policy, take local snapshots of your infrastructure environments, perform restores, provide that level of self-service backup and recovery to your users. So your user doesn't need to understand the intricacies and the differences of what happens if I'm trying to restore my cluster from an Azure disk to an Azure file, right? I can make use of almost a wizard-like environment to recover that application by myself. So here's just some screenshots. There's since we're all on YouTube here, you can check out our YouTube page. There's some videos of some demos posted there on YouTube, but just some screenshots to help get you started in visualizing what CloudCasa would look like from a screenshot and dashboard perspective. So we're looking at the entire environment, right? We've discovered you've simply scanned in your cloud accounts from Azure, AWS, Google, right? You scan in your on-prem clusters, and we're telling you exactly what you're protecting and what you're at risk for. All your data policies are going to be here. In terms of discovery from cloud accounts, all you're doing is simply providing us with a access portal into your cloud account. So we're going to launch CloudFormation Stack, Azure Resource Manager, Google Compute Engine to gain access to your clusters or your cloud accounts, and then perform an audit discovery on your environment. And you can see all the different clusters that are out here that we've discovered. Installing or configuring it to CloudCasa by deploying and pushing out an agent is just as simple as clicking on the install button here within this screenshot. And wrong way. And this is just some screenshots of recovery from backup, how easy it is to do. But we're keeping a catalog, right? Hence the name Catalogic software, right? We're keeping a catalog of all the different recovery points that you have out there. It's going to look exactly the same as you move between the different clouds. But based off of what you want to recover, where you want to recover it to, it's all going to be driven by these policies that you can create within the UI, or executing just through a REST API call within the command line using a REST API key. So, and I think that's about it for our presentation. But Bart, are there any questions out there?
Yeah, one of the things that came up in the very beginning, and you were mentioning about, okay, people are looking at different cloud vendors. We're very much in this cloud native space. there are different factors that have to be taken into consideration. This is a sort of open question, but something that came up not that long ago in a conversation about storage, when a particular enterprise was faced with deciding which storage vendor was going to be the best and looked at different reports. One of the things they mentioned, though, is a key factor that they were actually putting beyond all the others was the importance of establishing a good relationship with partners on the other end, in the sense that there can be great technologies, but if there aren't great people that you can count on to be able to troubleshoot, because let's face it, some of the stuff you're saying involves a lot of steps, can be quite timely. How do you approach that human factor, and how do you in Catalogic CloudCasa approach that in order to make sure that you're getting the right fit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bart. So I think with Catalogic software, and all the products that we've developed along the way, we've taken a very much vendor agnostic approach to data protection, right? We understand that there are a lot of different options out there, from, let's say, tape libraries to storage vendors to cloud vendors, and we want to actually allow our customers to make use of whatever decision that they would like to go through without changing the way in which they would create a policy within our own product, right? So we are very much open and have been a very big proponent of storage and cloud vendor products. We've actually had a webinar session an hour ago with a cloud container storage provider on that, but we are not going to limit you in terms of what storage you are selecting. Of course, there are some things out of our control, like being the CSI drivers that not all being created equally, as we discovered within representing or discovering Azure files versus Azure disk. But as I say, a lot of problems in today's world can be resolved via software, and being the software development company that we are, we can we're striving to solve those issues and make things a lot simpler for end users that are just embarking on the space and really don't want to bother with setting up a Velero or a custom application. Simply sign on to and sign up for a free account on our portal and start immediately managing their backups through CloudCasa.
Gotcha. No, very, very good points all across the board there. And like you said, because for some people this can be daunting, Kubernetes can be challenging as it is. When it comes to data, the sort of way of looking at it for a lot of folks still might be leave it alone, don't touch it. It's best where it is. But some people more and more organizations are making these transitions, and they're left with these questions: how are we going to go about this? And what Sebastian was mentioning as well too is that if you make a bad choice and you're left with a very, very slow solution, time is money, and it's going to be bleeding the most precious valuable asset that a company has. Sebastian, when entering an organization and having to convince folks that this is the right way to go, are there any tips, tricks, or metaphors that you might use that might make the conversations easier for some people that might be reluctant to adopt some of these strategies?
Oh, that's a good question. Like when I joined 2 years back, I was full of enthusiasm. That was my a first job. I'm still in. Something to make it easy. It's hard to come up with something right now.
That's okay. No, but is there anything? Because we've heard lots of different things. Say the Kelsey Hightower example of Kubernetes being a post office or things like that. But when we're looking at data, some might say that data is an anchor that keeps your boat stable. You lift your anchor when you need to go to another place, and then you put it back down. Different ways of looking at it. But what are some of the things that you find that people might not be so sure about? The sort of anticipation of, if something goes wrong here, I don't want to be held responsible. What are the things that people seem to be concerned about?
So people most concerned about, I believe, when it comes to a backup and all of that, their data management is definitely privacy and security of their data, right?
Got it.
This is something very important. Like I mentioned, every business runs on data, and you need to keep in mind that your data needs to be protected, and it must be protected securely. So I believe this is the biggest concern, and that's what we mentioned on slides, right? Use your own storage if you can, and use those services like Azure Private Links. It really reduces your exposure, drastically. Your business and your data becomes much more safer.
Very, very good point. Like you said, privacy and security. No one wants to be, held accountable for not protecting the privacy and security of someone's data. Something we're all very conscious of. We have governments regulating these things. We have different things we have to keep in mind. So I think those are all good points to keep in mind when people are having these conversations. Like, these conversations are going to happen, so we have to anticipate the doubts and the issues. Got another question. Is this only Azure to AWS S3, or are other transfer types supported?
So as of now, right, when you create a cluster, let's say you back up Azure AKS cluster, you can recreate AKS cluster. When you create AKS cluster, you can also recreate AKS cluster. I'm not sure if I can say, but something is going to change in that matter in a very short period of time. But as of now, if you have AKS, you can recreate AKS. If you have Azure, you can create Azure cluster. If you have AWS cluster, you can create AWS cluster as of now.
Okay. All right. Very, very good. Well, that being said, that was a wonderful presentation. Great job to both of you. Very dynamic. It's not the easiest topic to address, and I think you're handling it very, very well in a very concrete and practical way. Once again, I think for some folks out there, Kubernetes might be challenging. Then we get into these day 2 questions. And for some folks, it gets really challenging. So breaking it down and showing there are steps that can be gone through and these things can be taken care of. Sometimes we heard folks say, you need to have a backup and restore solution no matter what. And I think people are relatively aware of that. But I think that might oversimplify the notion and some of the very things that you were explained today. So like I said, very grateful for that presentation. Looking forward to more in Detroit, right, on October 24th. If you can stop sharing your screen really quickly so that I can share mine. Just before we finish up. So as is tradition in the Data on Kubernetes community, while you wonderful gentlemen were sharing your presentation, we have an amazing artist who's creating an artistic depiction of what you were talking about. His name is Angel. He's extremely talented. So here you can see the stuff that he was working on, see people moving through different clouds, lots of different action going on there. But I think it's a nice summary of the things that were discussed today. Thank you both very much for joining us. And thanks to the folks out there for your questions. If you have any further questions, please feel free to get them in Slack. We'd be happy to address them. We had Satya mentioning that we could probably take this topic a little bit further, another session to focus more specifically on the automation with CI/CD pipelines. Seems like there's some genuine interest in that. So I look forward to that, as well as many other conversations with the folks from CloudCasa by Catalogic. I will improve my pronunciation on that next time. Until then, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks all. Thanks, Bart.
All right, take care. Cheers.